Here we are, we have arrived. In previous episodes, Liz and I have laid the foundation for why the grading method is needed, the 4 qualities of effective feedback, and how to utilize student-designed rubrics in the classroom. Now, I'm going to describe my method of assigning writing and providing feedback, what we've dubbed the grading method. I'll give the basics to start, and then I'll provide you ways that you can tailor this approach to your classroom and the skills you need to focus on teaching. That is the beauty of this method. You can adapt it to your needs. I've taught almost every level of English, from SPED collab courses to AP to IB, and I've modified this approach depending on the needs of my students, the skills I want them to learn, and the pace at which I want to go in my classroom. Here's a quick review of the 4 pillars of effective grading. S for specific, T for timely, E for easy to understand, and P for personal responsibility. We also created an acronym to help guide us through the grading method. I will walk through each part and how this method can look in different grade levels and with different lessons. Our acronym is GRADER. G, give directions, R, rubric, A, assignment, D, display models, E, edit, and R, reflect. Let's start with a lesson in English 9. At our high school, we want students to be able to write a theme statement. We emphasize the importance of writing a whole thematic statement, not just using a single word like love or war or death to describe a theme, but to actually explain what the author is saying about that particular theme topic. Assuming you've taught them this skill and now want to assess this skill, let's consider a plan of attack. G, give directions. We have to start with assigning the task to the students. They need to know what they're doing and what's expected of them. In this situation, you can provide a prompt and instructions. One of my favorite ways to teach theme statements is by using Disney Pixar shorts. They're a few minutes long, often don't have words, and convey a very clear theme that students can usually grasp, but have to infer because of the lack of dialogue. Plus, they're fun. Who doesn't love a cute little Disney short? So, I'll explain to the students that they're going to apply their thematic knowledge after watching a Disney short. I'll provide them instructions and a prompt such as, after watching Night and Day, write a theme statement about the universal message of this Disney short. I will provide the prompt, display it on the board, repeat it about 1,000,000 times, and so forth. Next, R, rubric. After giving the directions for the assignment, work with your students to create a rubric per Liz's instructions. Since this particular lesson is only focused on assessing one skill, the ability to write a theme statement, making a rubric shouldn't take too long. Because my school used standards-based grading, I could have chosen to assess 1 or 2 standards, one about the writing of the theme statement, and one about the literary analysis involved in creating the theme statement. Or, if your school doesn't use standards-based grading, you can just give 1 overall score for the effectiveness of the theme statement. Just remember the first pillar in STEP. Keep it specific. Do not assess them on all aspects of their writing. Don't even get into grammar yet, especially if you're in the beginning of the school year. You want to focus on higher level items of writing, analysis, organization, etc., before diving into the sentence level issues of grammar and punctuation. Next in our acronym, A for assignment. This is where the students complete the task. In this English 9 lesson, now is the time where you show a new Disney short that you haven't gone over with them at all in class. In the transcript, we provided a list of links to videos that would work well for this lesson. Show the video at least twice so students can analyze and determine what the theme of the short might be, so they can then write their own theme statements. Have them submit the theme statements by the end of class. I always use Turnitin.com. Remember, starting out with freshmen at the beginning of the year, these first 3 steps could maybe be accomplished in 1 class period, but I'd plan for 2 to make sure you and the students have enough time. I live and breathe the motto, go slow to go fast. I know grammar nerds know it should be go slowly to go quickly, but it doesn't have the same ring, so just work with me. You want to lay the foundation at the beginning of the year, so take your time with these lessons. Don't rush. Here is where we reach D for display models. Immediately, the very next day after students submit their writing, you will show models. The students worked on their writing the day before, and you're going to give them immediate feedback the next day. Not days later, not weeks later, not months later. This is where the timely from our 4 pillars comes in. You are giving feedback the very next day. A quick side note. When showing models, I'm always very cognizant of not analyzing students' work as a model in the same class period. This is where I work to collaborate with friends who are teaching the same lesson, or I just create a different Google presentation with different models for each class period. So I'll take models for my first period class and use them for my third period class's lesson and vice versa. If I know a colleague assigned the same prompt, I'll ask them to send me a few models from their students so I can look at those with my classes. I'll usually ask for a high, medium, and low, and that way I can be sure I'm not looking at any of my own student essays while that student is sitting in my class watching us dissect their paper. It's a little more work up front, but the beauty of this grading format is that I can reuse lessons from year to year. I often assign the same prompts and can use student models from previous years once I've created the lessons. This saves an enormous amount of time for me after putting in the initial investment, and then I don't have to worry about dissecting a student's own work while they're sitting there. So back to D, display models. The students come in, we review the rubric and how I'll be assessing them. Then we start looking at models. It's up to you if you want to start with high, medium, or low. I read the model to them, have them discuss in groups, and provide rationale as to why they think the student deserves a particular score per the wording in the rubric. Then we have a class-wide discussion, and I explain what score I would have given and why. We go through this process with a few other models. This is where the E in STEP comes in, easily understandable. I am providing them feedback directly in class where they can ask clarifying questions if they are confused. There are no written comments of thesis needs to be more specific or theme statement is too broad. I can explain clearly what that means in class by looking at models and answering questions. Then, after looking at models in class, we move directly to E for edit. I provide them an opportunity to revise and resubmit their theme statements immediately so that they're able to apply the feedback I just gave them. I always provide time in class so that the information I provided is fresh and so they can continue to ask clarifying questions if they're confused in the revision process. I also let them know that I'm going to grade their revisions, not their original submissions. In fact, they won't receive a grade for their assignment unless it is the revised assignment. Remember, back to the research I cited in one of our earlier episodes. Both groups of students, when assigned writing, regardless of teacher feedback or intervention, improved their scores simply through the act of revising their writing. This is why I require revisions. I don't make it optional. Many teachers I've talked to complained about how they allow and offer revisions, but only a few students actually do them. Again, another reason why I only grade the revisions. It provides an added layer of accountability, and I don't have to grade and assess multiple drafts of the same assignment. The last part of the acronym is vital. R for reflect. Not only do I tell my students that I will only grade the revised work, but I also tell them that I will only grade their assignment if they include a brief paragraph explaining what they changed from their original submission and why they made those changes. This is where metacognition comes in. Students have to think about their learning and reflect upon their learning to truly see and understand why they are making changes. I don't grade a revision if it doesn't include a reflection paragraph, and I don't grade the original submission. There were some growing pains in this process. Students would insist that they had submitted an assignment, and I would have to remind them gently of the requirements of the assignment and how I would only grade a revised assignment with a reflection paragraph. Once I established these routines, however, and they got used to it, they learned my expectations, and they also learned the rationale behind what I expected of them because I explained it to them. I walked them through the importance of each step. So, we've made it through the steps of the grading method with a lesson in English 9. Quick review. G for give directions. R for rubric. That's where you're creating a student-designed rubric together in class. A for assignment. This is where you provide time for students to complete the assignments in class or at home. D for display models. The very next day after they submit an assignment, show models in class. E for edit. Provide time immediately after showing the models for students to edit and revise their work. And then R for reflect. Have students include a paragraph explaining the changes they made in their revision and why they made those changes. Once the students have submitted their revisions and reflection paragraphs, I don't write any comments on their final submissions. I go through quickly, grading and assessing the 1 or 2 standards I'm looking for. And at this point, I'm very familiar with the rubric because we've created it together and discussed it as a class in every single step. And then I assign a score. If students have further questions about their score, I always encourage a writing conference during intervention or during designated class periods where I set aside time for conferences. This allows me to provide further feedback if a student is motivated and needs something more personalized or specific, but it's happening during class time. So, all of the feedback has occurred during work hours. The grading, of course, is usually still done during a prep period or at home, but it's accomplished so much more quickly without the need to write comments or assess countless skills. When you're closely familiar with the specific skills you're assessing, you can fly through the papers and assign grades quickly and efficiently. This is the heart and soul of the grading method, providing meaningful, intentional, and research-based feedback while also saving countless hours of time grading. All right, let's apply the grading method to an English 11 classroom. Now, instead of just assigning a single theme statement, we're assigning a body paragraph. So I taught English 11 during the COVID years. Should I even mention that time period to a group of teachers? When I was trying to think of a topic that would keep my students engaged in an online environment, I realized that one of my all-time favorite productions would fit the bill, Hamilton. It encompasses a time in American history, it provides endless authorial and literary techniques to analyze, and it relates to numerous current events to promote more buy-in from students, along with developing critical thinking skills. So, I developed an extensive unit where we watched and analyzed Hamilton, and it remains one of my favorite units that I've ever taught. That being said, I'm going to use some sample paragraphs from this unit to show how a grading cycle might look in this particular circumstance. Also, another little side note, I truly believe that the literary analysis paragraph is an under-discussed and undervalued weapon in a teacher's arsenal. A paragraph is a much quicker way of assessing the same skills as an essay, minus tying all the ideas together between and among paragraphs. A single literary analysis paragraph has a claim in the topic sentence, evidence to integrate, analysis to include and develop, a concluding statement to tie ideas together, and of course, it must adhere to grammatical rules and MLA format. There are so many skills that a teacher can assess in a single paragraph rather than a full-blown essay. In my research, numerous sources discuss this as a way to cut back on grading, assigning more singular paragraphs rather than full essays. I could not agree more. Okay, back to the epic Lin-Manuel Miranda. After making our way through the first part of the musical, teaching lessons on topic sentences, literary analysis, quote integration, etc., it was time to assess a cohesive piece of writing. Let's go through our acronym, G for Give Directions. I provided the students the following prompt. Write a fully developed literary analysis paragraph where you analyze how Lin-Manuel Miranda develops his message in your chosen song. When I taught this online, we actually wrote a whole essay that I split into separate parts, but for the sake of this lesson, we're focusing on a single analytical paragraph. I explained the prompt in detail to my students and had them start thinking about which song in Act 1 they wanted to analyze. Next, R for rubric. Work with your students to create the student-designed rubric. For a literary analysis paragraph, I'd probably focus on assessing 1 to 2 skills. Those skills would depend on if we were early on in the school year or later in the school year, and which skills I had already assessed. For this particular paragraph, we'll focus on quote integration, a writing skill, and literary analysis, a reading skill. Once we've created the rubric, I'd move on to A for assignment and give students the rest of the class period to pick the song they wanted to analyze for their paragraph and to begin assembling quotes. I'd also give students the next day in class to actually work on writing their paragraphs. This provided me an opportunity to go around and give immediate feedback during the writing process. I'd either have students submit their paragraphs by the end of class, or I'd make the assignment deadline sometime later that night. Next, D, display models. Again, the students are receiving feedback the very next day. The handout I went over with my juniors was adapted from my brilliant friend and colleague, Brittany Strohsnyder. She shared her worksheet she put together for having students reflect on their writing. And I started to use this as a tool for both going over models with students and also holding them responsible for their reflection and revision. Remember, personal responsibility. Let's take a look. So what I love about this worksheet is that you can vary the way you deliver this lesson. You can have students look at the paragraphs individually, then discuss with a group, then share out as a class. Or if it's earlier in the school year and you want to hold their hands a bit more, you can go over the paragraph as a class, color marking it together, and modeling for them how to assess the piece of writing. Whichever way you choose to deliver instruction with this worksheet, the goal is for the students to analyze the paragraphs in a methodical manner. Color marking is a powerful tool for them to visually see the ratio of evidence to analysis, to make sure they have all of the essential components of a paragraph to assess whether or not they have enough transitional phrases, and whichever other skills you want them to focus on. Then, after color marking and discussing the models as a class, it's time for students to move on to E and R, edit and reflect. Let's look at the boxes they need to fill out. What I learned from looking at the models and what I need to revise. What are my goals for this next piece of writing? Revised paragraph with color marking. This is what I changed about it, and this is how I grew. I believe I earned a blank for my organization and analysis because blank. In these boxes, you are encouraging and fostering the metacognitive piece of education, where you are pushing them to think about their thinking, to think about their learning. Like we've mentioned in previous episodes, metacognition in the classroom has been proven to increase student buy-in and academic performance, and it helps deepen their critical thinking skills. So, when they submit this worksheet, I can peruse their answers to see what they wrote and how they're reflecting on their writing, and then I can quickly grade their color-marked revised paragraph. If they don't submit their worksheet, or if it isn't filled out, they don't earn a score on this assignment. Again, I won't grade their original, only their revision, and only if it includes a reflective portion of the worksheet. Grading happens so much more quickly because you don't need to write comments on each worksheet. You've already given them feedback. And if a student wants more feedback, again, I always offer a chance for a writing conference to further discuss why they earned a particular grade. Okay, let's look at one more example of how the grading method can work. Let's jump into assigning a full essay in an IB classroom. I'm going to show a lesson that I taught in the spring with my IB students when we read Beloved by Toni Morrison. Later in the school year is a great time to teach more sentence-level grammatical and stylistic strategies in their writing. Now that you've established the broader structure of writing, you can get into the details, the style, the flow, and the grammatical pieces of the writing process. So G, give directions. For this particular essay, I provided numerous prompts for my students and had them pick the one they felt they could answer in the strongest manner. R, rubric. Because the IB program has rubrics they use to assess writing, I chose to use a generic IB rubric for this particular assignment. It's later in the school year, so the students were well versed with the rubrics by this point and understood the requirements. A, for assignment. This essay was also an in-class essay, so I gave them the class period to complete their essays and submit them to turnitin.com by the end of the period. D, display models. Again, I show models the very next day. After briefly reading through the essays, my IB partner and I had noticed that we needed to help our students work on two particular skills: varying their sentence types and providing original analysis. Because we didn't use a student-designed rubric this time and we didn't go over a particular skill to assess beforehand, we were able to provide feedback based on what we noticed in the first draft of essays. This is a great way to provide some variety in using the grading method. So, based on the areas where we wanted to provide feedback, the skill of varying sentence types is a relatively simple and straightforward skill to teach. As you can see in the presentation slides, I go through and explain some different strategies for how to vary sentence beginnings and sentence structure. We talk about it as a class, and then we look at models of how students did this well or didn't do it well, and I provide time for discussion and revision. But moving on to the second skill, teaching the skill of original analysis, is one of the hardest things to do as an English teacher. I taught Beloved in the spring, which means I had many, many months with my students by that point. And teaching original analysis is part of our everyday lessons. But I was still noticing that students were being repetitive in their writing. So after going over sentence structure, we dove into looking at models. Some of the models I showed had analysis that was directly reflective of class discussions with zero original ideas, and students noticed that immediately. When I showed an essay that had analysis that was new and provided additional insight on top of what we talked about in class, the students could also immediately identify the difference. Again, the way I go through models with my students differs. Sometimes I just project it on a Google presentation, read it to them, and then discuss it all together as a class. Sometimes I use my smartboard to add notes. Sometimes I print the models for each student to mark and discuss in smaller groups. Sometimes I have students color mark. I vary the way I go about showing models so it doesn't get stale or boring for the students, and so I can utilize various effective strategies to teach the material. Then, after providing feedback through displaying models, you allow students time for E and R, edit, and reflect. This could be a wonderful chance to use Brittany's worksheet and adapt it for this lesson, or if it's later in the school year, you could just allow some time for revision and reflection without as much structure. Regardless of whether you have tighter or looser requirements for the revision process, I always require a reflection paragraph so I know students are thinking and reflecting upon what they changed and why they made those changes. I want to know that they understand what changes they made and why, because of how instrumental that metacognitive piece is in the learning process. Then I have my students submit the revision and reflection either during class or later that night, so they do it when the information from the feedback process is fresh. And of course, I only grade it if they include that reflection paragraph. As you can see, there are a variety of ways you can use the grading method. You can adapt it according to the grade you teach, your classroom demographics, where you are in the school year, what skills you want to focus on, etc. The heart and soul of the grading method is our acronym. First, give your students directions, then create the student design rubric, then provide time for your students to complete the assignment, display models the very next day, allow time for your students to edit and make revisions to their work. And before they submit, write a reflection. But as you've seen in the 3 examples I've provided, how you go about incorporating these pieces into your classroom is entirely up to you. There are endless ways you can utilize the process behind the grading method in your classroom, and we are so excited to see how you can apply these techniques in helping your students learn and grow, while also cutting back drastically on the hours you spend grading outside the classroom. For now, get planning.